My name is Daniel, and I am 28 years old. I never thought that in the course of my life, I would experience something that defied all logic and plunged me into a nightmare from which, to this day, I still have not been able to wake up. It all began when, due to family matters, I was forced to leave the city and move to the small town of Blackwood, nestled in the rugged mountains of Colorado. There, on an isolated family ranch, the boundaries between reality and the inexplicable became blurred. From the first day, rural life surprised me with its apparent calm and the almost mystical atmosphere that permeated every nook and cranny of the place. The landscapes stretched into vast fields of corn and dusty roads that seemed forgotten by time. I took refuge in solitude and in working on the ranch, trying to find peace in the routine. However, this tranquility would soon be interrupted by events that defied all explanation. Among the few consolations that this new world gave me was Rusty, a mixed-breed dog with a tan coat that came into my life almost by accident. He was a gift from my Aunt Margaret, who, seeing my desolation over my parents' departure, wanted to offer me a little bit of affection in the form of that small furry being. Rusty became my inseparable companion, accompanying me on long walks through the hills, guarding my steps as I explored hidden paths in the undergrowth. In silence, he seemed to understand my sorrows and fears. His lively and sincere gaze comforted me in moments of loneliness. During the first months, life in Blackwood passed with a monotonous but comforting routine. I dedicated myself to helping with the work of the ranch, plowing the fields, and taking care of the cattle. However, on those nights when the moon hung pale in the sky and the wind brought with it ancestral murmurs, I began to feel a restlessness that I could not explain. Local legends spoke of wandering spirits and beings that inhabited the forgotten corners of the mountains, but I, skeptical by nature, attributed those stories to town superstitions. The first sign that something was wrong appeared in a subtle way. One afternoon, after a long day working in the fields, I returned to the ranch and noticed that Rusty was not waiting for me at the door as he usually did. I thought that perhaps he had escaped to sniff around in some unknown corner. However, as night fell, his absence became palpable, and the silence of the house was filled with a tension that I could not dissipate. I went out to look for him, not knowing very well where my steps would take me. I walked along dirt paths and streams that wound between the crops, calling his name with a trembling voice, but the echo was the only one that answered me. The next day, already desperate, I entered the immense cornfield that extended as far as my sight could reach. The heat was suffocating, and the humidity impregnated each leaf, but something urged me to continue. It was then that I saw him among the tall ears of corn, a small bundle moving slowly. My heart accelerated when I distinguished, in the middle of that maze of corn, the figure of Rusty. Without thinking, I approached cautiously, afraid of startling him. When I arrived, I could see that his fur was dirty, covered in dirt, and with spots that seemed darker than usual. His eyes, once lively and expressive, looked dull and lacking that spark that comforted me so much. I carried Rusty in my arms, and despite his apparent lethargy, I took him back to the house. During the night, while I tried to sleep, all I could hear was the animal's weak moan and an incessant whisper of the wind that seemed to recite old spells. My mind, fatigued by work and worry, tried to convince itself that it was only a passing discomfort. However, from that night on, the feeling of being watched began to invade me relentlessly. As the days went by, Rusty was progressively transforming. At first, I attributed it to the fatigue and disorientation that he may have suffered after his disappearance, but soon I noticed disturbing changes in his behavior. His gait stopped being happy and carefree. Instead, he adopted an almost upright posture, as if something inside him had awakened and refused to be repressed. During my walks around the ranch, I watched with horror as he followed me at a certain distance, moving erratically without the naturalness of a common dog. One night, when the darkness seemed to engulf every corner of the ranch, I woke up startled by a sound that seemed to come from the yard. With my heart beating 1,000 times an hour, I got up and looked out the window. In the light of the moon, Rusty's silhouette was outlined, but something about him was unmistakable. His body moved with an unnatural rigidity, and his fixed, cold gaze seemed to pierce the darkness in search of something. I couldn't help but feel that that animal had ceased to be my companion and had become something much more sinister. Something that didn't belong to this world. The following days were filled with episodes that defied explanation. While I worked in the field, the sound of crunching leaves and the incessant murmur of the wind seemed to form a macabre chorus. On more than one occasion, as I turned the corner of a cobblestone road, I glimpsed Rusty standing in the middle of the weeds with his head tilted and his ears alert, as if he sensed something coming my way. I especially remember that afternoon when I decided to venture alone into a cornfield far from the ranch. The sunlight was fading quickly, and twilight was giving way to a starless night. While I was digging some small holes to mark a new irrigation system, I felt the air becoming unbreathable and that something wasn't right. It was at that precise moment when I heard a sound that was almost imperceptible at first but soon transformed into a deep and anguishing lament. I walked slowly toward the origin of that cry, trying to understand its origin, and it was then that my sight fell on the gaunt and twisted figure of Rusty, standing on his hind legs in the middle of the crop. The scene paralyzed me. There, in that sea of stems, Rusty seemed to inhabit a form that did not correspond to that of a dog. His movements were slow and calculated, and his thin body contorted into unnatural postures. The only explanation that occurred to me was that something had possessed my pet, transforming him into an entity that defied all logic. With my heart in my mouth, I approached slowly, fearing that my voice or a sudden movement could alter that macabre transformation. Each step echoed in my ears, and the air was charged with a penetrating cold that froze my blood. When I reached his side, I reached out to pet him, hoping to find in that gesture the comfort of the familiar. However, when I touched his back, I felt as if 1,000 thorns were digging into my skin. Rusty whimpered, and his once warm eyes now seemed like dark, empty wells, reflecting an alien and malevolent intelligence. There was no time for further doubts. In a fit of terror, the animal launched itself at me, its skeletal legs and sharp claws grazing my face, leaving a sensation of deadly cold. Panic gripped me. Between gasps and stifled screams, I managed to repel the attack using any object I had at hand. That aggression, although brief, left an indelible scar, both physically and in the depths of my soul. From that moment on, my existence became a constant struggle against fear. The nights became endless vigils in which every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The murmurs of the wind turned into whispering voices, and the creaking of the wood when it moved was like wails coming from another world. My relatives, although busy, were reluctant to accept that this was not a figment of my imagination. But in their eyes, you could read the fear and uncertainty. For several days, Rusty vanished completely, as if the entity that had possessed him had decided to withdraw, leaving behind a feeling of emptiness and hopelessness. I was unable to find any rational explanation. I locked myself in a state of permanent alert. The days passed in a succession of sleepless moments in which the slightest noise became a harbinger of terror. In every corner of the ranch, I thought I saw fleeting silhouettes and figures that vanished with a blink. Loneliness became a suffocating presence. The night I decided to temporarily leave the ranch to look for answers in the nearby town, I came across stories that were intertwined with local legends. The elders whispered about ancient spirits and forgotten deities that inhabited the mountains, beings that sometimes took the form of animals to approach humans and sow chaos in their lives. One of those stories spoke of an ancestral spirit known as the Wanderer that manifested itself on nights of the waning moon and fed on the fear of its victims. As I heard those words, a pang of terror ran down my back, because the description matched in a chilling way with what I had witnessed in my own home. As the days turned into weeks, my mind was caught in a whirlwind of memories and nightmares. Every morning, when I closed my eyes, I revived the image of Rusty. His empty gaze, the outline of his deformed figure, and that unmistakable lament that seemed to come from the depths of the underworld. My body, marked by the blows and wounds of that fateful night, could not escape the certainty that something had irremediably changed in my existence. The border between the real and the imaginary blurred, leaving me a witness to an inexplicable horror that haunted me every moment. One afternoon, while I was organizing the tools in the old shed on the ranch, I heard a slight rustling coming from outside. I approached cautiously, and to my horror, I saw that the half-open door revealed a familiar silhouette. It was Rusty, or at least the figure I thought I knew. However, instead of the dog I remembered, his eyes seemed like two abysses of darkness. The creature remained motionless, observing me with an intensity that defied reason. There were no words, not even a dull growl. The silence was so absolute that it was unbearable. With each beat of my heart, I understood that apparition was not simply my lost pet, but the messenger of an evil that had taken up residence in my life. I couldn't find the strength to approach, and the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. That night, I slept hunched in a corner of the room, afraid to move and wake whatever was stalking me in the darkness. My mind debated between disbelief and the certainty that something dark had taken up residence in the ranch. Every sound, every shadow was a reminder that the horror had ceased to be part of ancient legends to become my own reality. Now, as I remember every moment of those days, I wonder if I will ever be able to free myself from that presence. Time has passed, and the ranch has returned to an apparent calm, but on nights of the waning moon, I still perceive the silhouette of Rusty wandering among the shadows, his twisted figure and his gaze lost in an inhuman abyss. The experience marked me forever and made me understand that in the forgotten recesses of the mountains, the past and the supernatural intertwine in ways that our human mind can hardly understand. Today, as I write these lines, I do so with the hope that my story serves as a warning to those who venture into remote places. I do not intend to scare for the mere fact of scaring, but to share the harsh reality of a terror that hides in the everyday and that, in the blink of an eye, can transform the life of whoever dares to challenge the unknown. There are no simple explanations for what I experienced, and perhaps, in the end, the only answer is to accept that there are forces in this world that escape our understanding. Even with the passage of time on silent nights, I can feel the cold breath of that entity that manifested itself through Rusty. Every creak in the field, every sigh of the wind reminds me that the mountains hold ancient secrets, and that the thin line that separates the real from the unreal is sometimes as ephemeral as the light of dawn. The image of those empty eyes, of that form that stood up in the darkness, has been engraved in my memory. And although I try to convince myself that it was a product of tiredness and fear, the certainty of having witnessed something inexplicable never leaves me. Today, I live with the weight of that experience, with the conviction that what happened in Blackwood was more than a simple hallucination. It was the awakening of something ancestral, an echo of ancient legends that have existed since time immemorial in the mountains. And although I try to continue with my life, I know that in every shadow and in every forgotten corner hides the possibility that that horror may return to claim what was once its own. As I write these lines, I realize that my story is not a simple horror tale, but the testimony of a personal transformation born from an encounter with the inexplicable. At times, when I close my eyes, I can feel the beating of my heart racing and the presence of something watching me from the darkness. I don't know if one day I will be able to find peace, but what I do know is that the mountains hold secrets that should never have been disturbed, and that in that overwhelming silence, shadows are hidden capable of destroying the calm of the soul. This is my story, the chronicle of an eternal night in which reality dissolved into a whirlwind of fears and impossible presences. And although life has forced me to continue, deep within my being, I know that I will never be able to forget that night when, between the cornfield and the darkness, the shadow in the mountains manifested itself to change my destiny forever. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. I was never one of those who believed in ghosts, curses, or anything close to the supernatural. My life in the small town of Blackwood, nestled in the forgotten mountains of Montana, passed with the tranquility of a daily routine. I worked in the fields, I took care of my family, and like many, I listened to the legends of the elders without giving them much importance. But that night, something burst into my existence, something that still haunts me in the silence of my awakenings. It was a cold, dark night, My wife had taken our children to visit some relatives in the neighboring town, leaving me alone at home to take care of some urgent matters. When night fell, I retired to my bedroom with the idea of resting. I never imagined that sleep would take me to an abyss of terror that would blur the line between reality and legend. In the middle of the night, an unusual sound tore me from my lethargy. At first, I thought it was the murmur of the wind or the rustling of some branch against the window, but I soon realized that it was not so simple. A monotonous creak, like the groan of wooden wheels, crept through the silence of the house. The cadence was strange, almost archaic, and it didn't fit with the modernity of the town. Something in that sound awakened in me a deep fear, that of those stories I had heard as a child but always relegated to mere fantasies. With my heart racing, I sat up in the darkness and slowly approached the window. Outside, the street was empty, but the echo of the squeak persisted, getting closer and closer. It reminded me of an old warning the elders used to say, "If you hear the echo of wheels in the night, it is a sign that darkness is claiming what belongs to it." My mind, normally so logical and serene, began to doubt everything I thought I knew. Could it be that that legend, as old as the town itself, was manifesting itself before my eyes? The air in the room became thick, almost unbearable, and the sensation of being watched grew with each passing second. I felt as if time had stopped, and in that instant, a faint voice slipped through the whispers of the wind. It wasn't a scream or a shriek, but rather a barely perceptible murmur that seemed to pronounce my name with an icy cadence. I wanted to scream, but my throat froze, robbing me of the strength to protest. That voice, so strange and familiar at the same time, convinced me that it was not an illusion, but the presence of something that had remained on the fringe of the visible. Instinctively, I retreated a few steps and observed in the darkness. There, in the distance, a figure was vaguely outlined. It was not a human being in the conventional sense, but rather the silhouette of an old carriage, of those that nobody used anymore, that glided silently over the cobblestones of the street. I saw no horses, but something that seemed to propel it with an inhuman force, as if it were a specter that had been torn from a forgotten past. The roar of the wheels and that incessant whisper intertwined with my growing despair. Every creaking of the floor reminded me that in my home, the line between life and death had become blurred. The atmosphere was charged with an oppressive energy that seemed to want to smother my breathing, and for a moment, I felt that the same darkness swirled around me, seeking to suffocate me with its presence. For long minutes, I remained motionless, caught between the urge to run and the paralysis of terror. The carriage stopped right in front of my house, and at that precise moment, a dull thud, as if something heavy had fallen to the ground, echoed in the night. That mixture of noises, the persistent screech, the unmistakable thud, and the whisper that repeated my name, formed a macabre symphony that left me breathless. When finally the carriage began to move away, the sound gradually faded until it was absorbed by silence. I remained by the window, unable to move until calm returned, although it was not the usual peace, but a silence laden with dark omens. That dawn stretched into an agony of restlessness. Every shadow in my room seemed to hide a cold gaze. Every corner vibrated with an echo of imminent death. With the arrival of dawn, I tried to return to normality. I prepared some coffee in an attempt to calm my nerves, but the relief was short-lived. While I served that hot drink, the neighbors commented in low voices on the tragic news. Old Man Henry, a respected and enigmatic old man of the town, had passed away during the night. Some said that his death was a consequence of an illness, but others murmured that that same night, he had been visited by what was now known among the wise as the Carriage of Gloom. The rumor was chilling. The carriage had stopped right in front of my house, next to Old Man Henry's, and inside me, the certainty grew that something supernatural had snatched that man. The news plunged me into an overwhelming confusion. Could it be that the entity I had witnessed that night had come for Old Man Henry? Or perhaps my fate was irremediably linked to that dark presence. In the following days, I tried to resume my routine, but my soul was restless, plagued by the certainty that something had changed inside me. The looks of the neighbors, filled with a silent fear, and the murmur of conversations on the corners of the town made me feel that I was no longer the same as before. During the weeks that followed, my obsession to understand what had happened became almost unhealthy. I began to walk the forgotten paths of Blackwood, investigating dusty archives and silently conversing with those who, in whispers, shared the old legends of the town. And I discovered that my family had deep roots in ancestral rituals, forgotten pacts with forces that, in remote times, had been invoked to protect or condemn those who inhabited these lands. Those alliances, sealed in the shadows of faith and fear, seemed to have awakened something that had somehow claimed its revenge. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I sank into a whirlwind of questions. Why me? What guilt did I inherit that led me to become the target of that presence? Little by little, I began to notice details that before seemed trivial to me. Soft footsteps in empty hallways, furniture that was moved for no apparent reason, and shadows that slithered in the corner of my eye. My home, that had always been my refuge, had become a stage where death and the inexplicable played their macabre work. The house itself seemed to murmur forgotten secrets, and every creak in the darkness reminded me of the imminent proximity of that which had awakened that night. One afternoon, while I was reviewing some family documents, I found my great-grandfather's diary. In it, he recounted a similar experience. One night in which he woke up to the sound of wheels and the whisper of voices that seemed to come from beyond. According to his words, the carriage was not a simple means of transportation, but the vehicle of those souls that had been unjustly taken away, condemned to wander in search of redemption. That revelation filled me with a mixture of horror and resignation. Could it be that my existence had been sealed for generations, tied to a pact that transcended my understanding? Driven by the need to find answers, I entered the thick forest that surrounds Blackwood, a place full of history and legends. Under the light of a clouded moon, I followed a forgotten path that led me to a clearing where a makeshift altar stood. It was made up of eroded stones and remains of carved wood, on which strange symbols were drawn, reminiscent of a past full of sacrifices and mysteries. The atmosphere in that clearing was almost tangible. The mist danced between the trees, and the silence seemed to hide an ineffable secret. There, in the midst of that ancestral solitude, I understood that my search was not only for answers, but a fight against a force that had existed long before my birth. I returned home, convinced that I had to face this once and for all. But what I found was even more disturbing. The house that had been my sanctuary had become a prison of dark memories. Every corner exuded an oppressive atmosphere. In the gloom, it seemed that the walls whispered stories of tragedy forgotten. That very night, as the darkness closed in on me, I heard the distant echo of wheels again, accompanied by an unmistakable murmur. My name was pronounced with a cold that made my blood run cold. I could no longer ignore the terror that gripped me. With a determination born of a survival instinct, I decided to face my destiny. I opened the front door and went out into the street. The fog was thick and seemed to hide secrets around every corner. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, and the silence was broken only by the echo of my footsteps on the cobblestones. I walked aimlessly, trying to follow the trail of that presence that, like a magnet, was pulling me toward the unknown. My steps led me to the old church in town, an abandoned building that for decades had witnessed rituals and prayers said in low voices. Inside, I discovered inscriptions and symbols I had never seen before, pictorial accounts of pacts and condemnations that seemed to seal the fate of those who inhabited the region. Each stroke, each figure carved in the stone, narrated a story of pain, betrayal, and redemption. I felt I was on the threshold of a forbidden knowledge, where the line between the human and the divine blurs in a whirlwind of faith and despair. That revelation only intensified my anguish. I understood that, somehow, my destiny was intertwined with that of that spectral carriage, an echo of the curse that weighed on my lineage. Since that day, routine became a constant struggle against madness. Each night, as darkness fell, fear took hold of me. My imagination transformed into the crudest nightmare, and the incessant whisper of the inhuman fused with the beat of my heart. For days, I tried to regain some semblance of normality, but every conversation, every shifty glance from the neighbors reminded me that something had changed inside me. The whole town seemed to have resigned itself to the presence of the inexplicable. Some claimed to have seen shadows move through the streets. Others said they heard the distant echo of a thud on nights of the new moon. I, however, knew that the truth was even darker. I had awakened to something I could not control, something that claimed its part in the very fabric of life in Blackwood. Today, as I write these lines, I realize that the experience I lived that night has indelibly marked my soul. The image of the carriage, the echo of the wheels, and the icy whisper of my name have become inseparable companions, reminding me that death and the unknown always lurk in the darkest corners. Every twilight finds me fighting the terror of the inevitable, knowing that at some point, the echo of silence could return to claim what deep down belongs to it. I don't know if I will be the only one entrusted with this secret, or if others in Blackwood have been touched by the same curse. What is certain is that since that night, the border between life and legend has irremediably blurred in my existence. The darkness is no longer simply the absence of light, but a living entity that feeds on fear and the secrets buried in the soul of this town. And every night, as the gloom gathers and the wind brings with it the murmur of the impossible, I wonder if I'll ever find the peace I so crave. And so I conclude my tale, a confession of endless nights and timeless terrors. My life has been transformed by that experience, and every sunset reminds me that the darkness holds secrets that should never be unearthed. I hope that as you read these words, you understand that in the forgotten recesses of the soul, truth and legend merge into a whisper that resounds in eternity. And if you ever hear the echo of wheels in the night, remember that perhaps you are not alone. As I write, the image of that carriage draws itself once again in my mind, as real as the pain in my chest. Each shadow, each creak in the silence, is a reminder that what I lived through was not a product of my imagination, but the manifestation of an ancestral condemnation. The line between what is human and what is not is tenuous, and sometimes terrifying. And I have learned that facing terror is the only way not to succumb to it. Today, with the dawn dissipating the shadows of the night, I wonder if the echo of silence will return to my door. And if it does, I will know that the fight has barely begun. For the truth, no matter how dark it may be, always prevails over oblivion. With each passing day, I carry on, marked by the inexplicable but determined not to allow fear to rob me of the essence of my being. This is my story, my confession of what happened that fateful night. I seek neither sympathy nor disbelief. I only want it to be known that in the most remote corners of our existence are hidden secrets that defy all explanation. Perhaps by sharing my experience, I will find in others an echo of what I lived. Or perhaps it will simply serve as a warning that the darkness never truly dies, but reigns in every whisper and in every creak of the wooden wheels. And now, every twilight, as I gaze at the horizon in silence, I know that I must be alert, because in Blackwood, in the stillness of the night, the echo of silence continues to resonate, reminding me that the forbidden and the inexplicable always lurk in the shadows, waiting for the moment to re-emerge. My name is Daniel, and I am an engineer specialized in the restoration of historic structures. A few months ago, I was contacted to evaluate an old house in the small town of Blackwood, nestled in the mountains of Montana. Although the history of the place was full of legends and whispers, the idea of working on a construction that had resisted time seemed irresistible to me. The locals, however, warned me that the place was cursed, that as night fell, strange moans and footsteps could be heard on the old planks, and that no one dared to remain there after twilight. I arrived in Blackwood with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. From the first moment I stepped on the cobblestones of the town, I noticed a dense atmosphere full of secrets. The house, located on the outskirts and surrounded by ancient trees, seemed to emanate an unusual cold. Even in broad daylight, its structure, though majestic in its decay, showed cracks in its walls and beams that creaked in the wind. The silence that reigned in the atmosphere was almost absolute, as if nature itself refused to break the silence of the place. During the first days of inspection, I went through every corner of the house. I dedicated myself to analyzing plans and measuring every structural detail, trying to decipher the hidden history in each stone and each worn beam. It didn't take long to notice small events that, although they seemed trivial, disturbed my tranquility. On one occasion, I found work tools in different positions from where I had left them. On another, I saw fleeting shadows gliding through the corridors. My rational mind tried to explain everything as simple coincidences, but deep inside me, a growing fear was brewing. One afternoon, while reviewing plans in the large main room, a slight murmur made me stop. It was a barely perceptible whisper that seemed to emanate from the second floor. I decided to ignore it, attributing it to the wind among the cracked walls. But the sound repeated itself, clearer and deeper, like the lament of a tormented soul. With a racing heart, I went upstairs in search of the source, but I only found silence and deserted rooms. However, the feeling of being watched intensified with each step I took. The next day, in search of answers, I headed to the center of town and met with Old Man Henry, an elder with a penetrating gaze and a calm voice who knew the history of the house better than anyone. With measured words, he told me the tragic legend of Eleanor, the daughter of the former owner who fell madly in love with a humble worker. Her love, condemned by the iron will of her father, was marked by tragedy. It is said that Eleanor died in painful circumstances, her spirit condemned to wander between the walls of the house in an endless search for what could never be. Although my rational ideas pushed me to discard such stories, something in the way Old Man Henry spoke froze my blood. That same night, while the sky was covered with clouds and a storm raged without mercy, I was forced to remain in the house. The storm had isolated the town, and the rain beat furiously against the windows, generating an echo that mixed with the constant murmur of the structure. I turned on the lights in the main room, trying to drive away the shadows, but the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. Every creak of the old wood, every echo in the corridors, seemed to announce the presence of something inexplicable. It was in the gloom of midnight when I felt it again, an unmistakable wail, prolonged and almost human, that emerged from deep within the house. I stood motionless, paralyzed with fear, not daring to move an inch. The sound, impregnated with a pain that defied all explanation, repeated itself with a rhythm that made me feel as if time stood still. There was no trace of wind or humidity that could have caused it. It was a cry that seemed to spring directly from the soul of the house. For hours, I remained sitting in an old chair, trying to ignore the incessant whispering. With each passing minute, the feeling of being watched intensified. Sometimes, I thought I heard soft footsteps dragging along the upper corridors. Other times, the faint rustle of something moving through the shadows. My mind debated between reason and superstition. And although I tried to convince myself that nothing supernatural was happening, an icy chill settled deep within my being. I remember trying to reason that everything was the fruit of tiredness and stress accumulated after long hours of working on the project. However, logic faded before the evidence of those inexplicable sounds and the palpable presence of a shadowy energy. The atmosphere became increasingly dense, and the loneliness of the night accentuated the terror that invaded me. The house that during the day seemed like a forgotten relic was transformed into a nightmare scenario where each and every corner hid secrets too dark to be revealed. Throughout that endless night, silence reigned again at times, but it was always interrupted by the echo of a lament or the subtle sound of footsteps fading away in the darkness. The relentless storm continued to lash the structure, making each crack and fissure seem to breathe in time with my own fear. The atmosphere was permeated with a disturbing presence, as if the house itself had become aware of my existence and decided to manifest its pain. With the dawn, the storm dissipated as suddenly as it had arrived, and an unsettling calm once again enveloped the house. However, the atmosphere had already changed forever. The oppressive burden seemed to have been impregnated in every wall, in every forgotten corner. As soon as I left the house, my mind kept going over what had happened, questioning every detail with a mixture of disbelief and terror. I returned to the town with a heavy heart and the certainty that what I had experienced was not a product of my imagination but the manifestation of a tragedy that refused to die. I finished the project and handed in my reports, but the memory of that night remained with me like a persistent shadow. I did not return to Blackwood, and sometimes, in the silence of the early morning, I wonder if that experience was real or simply the product of a mind saturated by isolation and the legends of the place. Over time, I tried to bury that episode deep in my memory, focusing on new projects in more modern and safer cities. However, every now and then, something as insignificant as the whisper of the wind or the creaking of an old structure would make me relive, even briefly, the horror of that night. I came to understand that in some corners of the world, especially in towns forgotten by progress, the supernatural is intertwined with reality in a way that defies all logic. Since then, I have dedicated part of my time to studying the history and legends of old buildings, trying to unravel the mysteries hidden behind their walls. Each building, each house, seems to hold within it the memory of those who once lived in it. And sometimes that memory manifests itself in ways that go beyond the tangible. In the case of the Blackwood house, the legend of Eleanor became an indelible scar on my soul, a warning that the past never completely fades. Even now, as I write these lines in the relative safety of my home, I can't help but feel that the echo of that night continues to resonate within me. The incessant whisper of regret, the sensation of being watched in the darkness, and the relentless presence of an ancient pain remind me that there are forces in this world that escape human understanding. The experience taught me that true terror lies not in what we imagine, but in the direct confrontation with that which hides in the shadows, in the silent abyss that lurks in the gloom. Today, as I remember in detail every moment from that night, I realize that the house in Blackwood was not simply a building in ruins, but a sanctuary of suffering and oblivion. In every corner, the hopelessness of a past that refused to die could be felt. And in every whisper, Eleanor's voice could be heard, crying out for a lost love and for the redemption of her spirit. It is a bitter lesson that I learned, that there are stories in this world so real and painful that, even if we try to forget them, they always come back to remind us of the fragility of human existence. If you ever have the opportunity to work in a place full of history and mystery, I advise you not to underestimate the power of the past. The restoration of an old building is not just a matter of repairing walls and beams, but of reconnecting with the souls that inhabited those spaces, of recognizing the echo of their sorrows and their joys. Because in every shadow, in every sepulchral silence, hides a story of horror and love that defies time. I don't know if one day I'll have the courage to face my memories of that town again. But what is clear to me is that this experience changed me forever. It left a mark on me not only as a professional but also as a man, teaching me that in the world, there are abysses and lenses that cannot be explained with logic or science. Perhaps deep down, what we fear is not what lurks in the darkness, but the revelation that there are parts of ourselves that we still do not understand. As I write, the night approaches, and a cold breeze sneaks through the window. For a moment, I close my eyes, and I can almost hear the distant lament of a lost soul. I do not want to fall into paranoia, but I know that the line between reality and legend is thinner than I would like to admit. In every corner of oblivion, in every ruined building, there are voices that whisper secrets of times past. And I, who was a witness to one of those whispers, still live with the certainty that true terror resides in the eternity of silence. Today, my path has taken me far from Blackwood, but sometimes, in the solitude of the night, I feel that the echo of that house accompanies me, reminding me that there are mysteries impossible to erase. And it is that in the silent abyss of that ancient dwelling hides an ancestral pain, a story that cries out to be heard, and in its incessant lament, it merges with my own soul. My name is Daniel, and I live in Blackwood, a small town nestled between the mountains of Colorado. Since I was a child, this corner forgotten by the bustle of the city offered me the apparent security of a quiet existence, marked by the immutable passing of the days and the almost absolute silence of the night. However, in some bend in time, I understood that in the stillness, dark secrets are hidden, presences that blur the line between reality and legend. Ever since I inherited the modest house from my grandparents, I have felt that Blackwood holds enigmas that refuse to be buried by routine. The adobe houses, the dirt streets, and the open countryside become the perfect setting for the manifestation of that which time wanted to bury. The loneliness that in other places is a balm, in this place becomes a burden that portends the inexplicable. For many years, I convinced myself that tranquility was synonymous with peace. But one autumn night, everything changed. I remember that night, the air had turned icy, and the moon was hiding behind dense clouds, leaving the world sunk in a darkness that seemed alive. While I was preparing a simple dinner in the kitchen, the unusual crying of my dog, Rusty, broke the monotony. Rusty, a faithful and normally serene companion, seemed restless, and his agitation awakened in me an anxiety that I could not understand. With a pounding heart and armed only with a flashlight, I went out into the yard to discover what was disturbing the calm of my home. The darkness was so impenetrable that the light from the flashlight was seen almost as a whisper in the night. The shadows lengthened in unnatural shapes on the walls, and each creak of the floor echoed in the silence. It was then, a few meters from the entrance, I made out a slender, almost translucent figure that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The presence was so intense that for a brief moment, I felt that time had stopped. The figure was not moving, but its countenance, if it could be called that, seemed fixed in a penetrating gaze that encompassed everything. Terror invaded me without warning, as if something from another world had decided to manifest itself before my eyes. I slowly backed away, caught between the impulse to flee and the compulsive need to discover the truth. That night, insomnia took hold of me, and the murmur of the wind in the trees became a threatening echo. During the following nights, the atmosphere in Blackwood became oppressive. Rusty would not stop growling as darkness fell, and in the silence of the early morning, every small sound seemed to announce the presence of something inhuman. The experience made me question the old stories that the town elders used to tell, about a shadow that, on nights of a new moon, emerged to claim what they believed was lost in time. At first, I laughed at those legends, attributing them to superstition. However, every hint of movement in the darkness, every inexplicable footprint in the mud, confirmed that something irrational and disturbing was looming over us. One night, unable to bear the uncertainty, I decided to venture beyond the limits of my property in search of answers. I walked along forgotten paths where the undergrowth and the echo of ancient footsteps seemed to intertwine, and I came to a small clearing. There, the moonlight filtered through with difficulty, and in the center, I discovered deep and elongated footprints that ended abruptly next to an old oak tree. It was as if the earth itself had been marked by the presence of a being that did not belong to this world. Fear began to nest in the depths of my being. Each twilight became a reminder that the night did not bring with it rest but the imminent appearance of that shadow. With the passing of the days, my mind was flooded with dark thoughts. The possibility that what I had witnessed was real, the disturbing certainty that something was still stalking me from the shadows. During my walks through the countryside, I could not help but notice that the landscape, always so serene, seemed to hide an evil presence, a secret that overflowed in every creak, in every whisper of the wind. One morning, I woke up abruptly, feeling a pressure on my chest, as if an invisible force was trying to crush me. The clock struck midnight, and the silence had become almost deafening. Without thinking, I went outside and cautiously advanced along a path that I knew by heart, but that night was shrouded in a thick fog. With every step, the feeling of doom intensified, and the air was impregnated with a stench of damp earth and decay. It was at that precise moment when the figure reappeared, this time much closer, barely touching the ground without making a sound. The motionless and enigmatic presence seemed to observe me carefully, as if measuring my will to continue facing it, and I felt my heart racing at a frantic pace. Minutes that seemed eternal passed before the figure vanished without a trace, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me like an indelible mark. The episode altered my way of seeing life. Fear transformed into an obsession that colored every aspect of my days. The routine in the field, the daily tasks, and the conversation with the neighbors, that before were simple customs, now became imbued with a latent terror. The stories of the elders, narrated in fearful whispers about an ancestral entity that roamed the mountains, began to have a meaning that I could not ignore. It was said that in times of darkness and drought, the shadow emerged to take revenge, claiming what was taken from him in life. The legend spoke of an unjustly condemned man whose fury and pain transformed into a curse on these lands. The memory of that figure became a persistent torment. Every night, when I closed my eyes, I revived the skeletal image of that shadow, and every sound in the darkness took on a threatening dimension. I decided then to document each event, meticulously noting down the details of the sightings, the inexplicable noises, and the footprints I found in the mud. I soon noticed a disturbing pattern. Most of the incidents occurred on moonless nights, when the darkness became almost tangible and the silence seemed to portend an inescapable destiny. My notes mingled with old stories, and little by little, I began to glimpse the connection between the curse that ravaged the town and my own experience. I couldn't help but delve into the history of Blackwood, searching through dusty archives and the confidences of older neighbors for some clue that would explain what I was experiencing. It was in the town's old abandoned church, a building that seemed a silent witness to oblivion, where I found the key to this enigma. One afternoon, driven by a mixture of desperation and curiosity, I ventured into its dark recesses, between worn-out benches and altars of noise. The light that filtered through the broken windows drew disturbing shadows on the walls. There, in an almost forgotten corner, I discovered old engravings that told the story of a man whose life was consumed by an unpunished injustice. That image, carved in stone, melted with my own torment, revealing the truth. The search for answers transformed into a personal crusade. Each night, I went out to roam the countryside, facing the darkness in the hope of unraveling the mystery. The path to the clearing where I had found the footprints became my obligatory route. On one of those nights, while the moon was setting behind a blanket of thick clouds, I saw reflected in the water of a small stream the silhouette of the figure, so real and so disturbing that I couldn't help but keep myself on dry land. That ephemeral and chilling reflection left me with the conviction that these were not simple hallucinations but a presence that fed on the pain and loneliness of this place. The atmosphere in Blackwood was changing. What was once a peaceful life was transformed into an existence marked by the constant vigilance of the night. The everyday sounds, the creaking of wood, the rustle of curtains in the breeze, became omens of imminent danger. The entire town seemed to have been touched by the same curse, and in every corner, memories of past tragedies were hidden, voices that were lost in the wind. As time passed, my mind was divided between logic and the inexplicable reality of horror. Each sunset became an internal battle. The desire to return to normal faced the terror of the unknown. The nights were eternal, and while I tried to fall asleep, my imagination, invaded by shadows, forced me to face my worst fears. The loneliness that at first seemed like a refuge turned into a prison from which I could not escape. On one of those endless nights, while I was walking through the cobblestone streets of Blackwood, I observed on the faces of some of the neighbors the mark of restlessness. Dead looks and forced silences spoke of secrets that no one dared to reveal. I wondered how many of them had felt like I had, the presence of that shadow. How many had been marked by the tragedy of a past that refused to die. Resignation had settled in the town, and fear was a silent companion in every conversation and in every sigh. As night fell, the inevitable duality of existence was revealed to me in the midst of the gloom. The inexplicable was not only an external phenomenon, but also an internal struggle against personal demons. I understood that the mortal shadow that walked through Blackwood was, in a way, the reflection of the wounds that each inhabitant carried within them. A reminder that forgetfulness and injustice leave scars that time can never erase. This revelation forced me to accept that the true curse of this place lies not only in the appearance of a supernatural entity, but in the collective inability to face and heal the wounds of the past. Today, as night falls over Blackwood and twilight dyes every corner with shadows, I find myself sitting in my old rocking chair, observing the dark landscape and listening to the incessant murmur of the wind. Every sound, every creak reminds me that the shadow is always there, lurking, waiting for the moment when routine is broken and horror becomes palpable. I don't know if I'll ever find answers, or if I'll ever be able to completely free myself from this disturbing presence. The only thing that is certain is that the mortal shadow has been part of my existence, an enigma that dwells on the thin line between light and darkness. I write these words as a testament, a sincere confession of a man who has seen beyond what is visible and has felt the terror in his own flesh. Every night that I close my eyes, the figure glides into my dreams, reminding me of the fragility of life and the inevitability of mystery. The legend of Blackwood and the curse that accompanies her have intertwined with my destiny, turning my existence into a constant struggle between reason and the abyss. The only certainty that remains is that as long as night falls again, the shadow will continue to be my inseparable companion, a presence that, without uttering a word, cries out in the silence and marks my path with its dark legacy. My story is an attempt to confront that terror, to exorcise a little of the pain of the past, and perhaps serve as a warning to those who dare to walk the forgotten paths of this town. Because in Blackwood, the horror is as real as the ground we walk on, and in every shadow hides the memory of a scream that will never be extinguished. Thus, between the echo of silence and the incessant beating of my heart, I keep walking in the darkness, defying each night and facing the unknown. The mortal shadow, that implacable presence, has marked my existence and reminds me that the true essence of terror lies in the confrontation with that which we cannot understand. And as long as the wind keeps whispering stories of injustice and oblivion, I will remain here, tied to this destiny, in an eternal confrontation with the darkness. My name is Margaret, and I am currently a mother and grandmother. I have 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren, and I live in Blackwood, a small town in the heart of Colorado. I have always considered myself a practical person, alien to ghost stories and dark legends, until that night in my adolescence changed my life forever. When I was 16 years old, I attended a party at the social center, The Refuge, a modest place with a wooden roof and a circular track where laughter and music mingled under the dim light of the street lamps. My parents, as was the custom in small communities, forbade me to go out alone, demanding that I be accompanied by a relative. That night, between promises of company and reluctance, I ended up walking alone along a dirt path, far from the hustle and bustle and safety of the group. The atmosphere was disturbingly cold, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. As I walked forward, the echoes of the party gradually faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the crunch of the leaves beneath my feet. The solitude of that path filled me with a strange mixture of fear and resignation. However, what I didn't know was that the night still had in store for me an encounter that would blur the line between the real and the inexplicable. As I walked slowly, trying to calm my nerves, a shadow appeared in the distance. At first, I thought it was a figment of my imagination, but as I got closer, I could make out the figure of a tall man with an old hat and boots that left their marks on the damp earth. His gait was slow, almost ritualistic, and although the darkness made it difficult to see details, something in his presence felt disturbingly familiar. I couldn't help but feel a shudder run through my body, my eyes fixed on that silhouette that seemed to follow me at a prudent but constant distance. With each step I took, the echo of his boots mixed with the murmur of the wind, and my heart beat wildly. The figure always remained on the periphery of my vision, as if it didn't want to be seen directly, but at the same time, its presence permeated the environment with an inescapable force. Instinctively, I quickened my pace. I wanted to leave behind that restlessness that oppressed me, but deep down, I knew I couldn't escape the unknown so easily. The road forked, and despite my fear, I decided to take the route that seemed slightly illuminated by the few streetlights that still fought against the night. However, the feeling of being watched grew with each meter I traveled, and the figure, always distant but present, seemed to glide between the gloom and the trees without caring about my direction. At one point, I was forced to deviate along a narrow path lined with thick vegetation. The humidity of the air and the distant murmur of nature enveloped me in an almost sepulchral silence. and in that lonely stretch, I noticed that the figure had disappeared. For a moment, I thought I had gained some respite, but it was then when a faint and distant voice seemed to whisper my name in the breeze. "Do not be afraid. I am with you." That voice, so familiar yet unreal, made me stop in my tracks. Could it be possible that the figure I had seen was the incarnation of the spirit of my grandfather, who had passed away years ago? The memory of his countenance, always stern but protective, flooded my mind. However, I knew I had to keep going because with each second on the street, my vulnerability increased. I accelerated my pace, with terror nailed inside me, feeling how each footstep of mine merged with the distant rumble of boots that seemed to replicate my own walk. The road seemed endless. The darkness grew thicker, and the cold more penetrating. The few lights of the houses, already turned off, barely managed to outline the facades of the buildings. The only certainty was that my home was several minutes away, and on that journey, each shadow seemed to hide an unspeakable secret. I came to a small clearing where the silence had become almost absolute. It was there when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the silhouette again. This time, its outline was more clearly defined. A man with a blurred face whose features were confused between the shadow and the intermittent light of a distant street lamp. For a brief moment, I felt his eyes boring into mine, and a mixture of love and sadness was reflected in that indescribable gaze. Fear became a lump in my throat, but deep within me, a strange calm was insinuated, as if that encounter had a greater purpose. Not daring to stop, I continued my walk. The sound of his boots echoed in the distance, marking the rhythm of my silent escape. The path became even narrower and, at the same time, more disturbing. The icy breeze caressed my skin and seemed to carry with it the echo of voices from the past. With every step, my mind debated between disbelief and the certainty of what I was experiencing. Was what my eyes perceived real, or was it a macabre game of darkness and tiredness? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the silhouette vanished, leaving behind a disturbing silence. As I reached the door of my house, I opened it without even looking back, eager to find refuge and safety in the familiar warmth. However, as I crossed the threshold, I noticed something strange. Some objects in the living room had been rearranged, and a slight current of cold air ran through the hallway, as if someone else had passed by moments before. Terror mixed with a confusing feeling of déjà vu, and although my mind told me it was a product of nervousness, something assured me that that night, something inexplicable had crossed the barrier of the tangible. That night, the memory of the echo of those boots and of the voice that seemed to whisper my name haunted me relentlessly. As I covered myself in bed, the silence became almost deafening, and every shadow in the room seemed to take on a life of its own. I could not sleep. Terror had settled in my soul, and the cold of the night was transformed into an inescapable reminder of the experience I had lived through. I clung to the idea that perhaps it was my imagination or a hallucination caused by tiredness, but deep down, I knew something had changed that night. Over the years, I have tried to relegate that episode to a corner of my memory, as if it were a dream from which I managed to wake up. However, on lonely nights, when silence takes over time and the cold seeps through the cracks of the house, the memory of that figure returns to me with the same intensity, like a specter that refuses to leave my existence. More than 30 years have passed since that fateful encounter, and each anniversary of that night plunges me into an abyss of memories and emotions. Blackwood has changed in many ways, but the atmosphere that surrounds its narrow streets and adobe houses retains an air of mystery. Sometimes, while the wind sneaks through the windows, I think I hear a whisper, a distant murmur that seems to come from times past, as if the souls of those who have departed were gathering to tell their secrets. During my youth, I tried to find rational explanations. I consulted healers and listened to stories from elders who claimed to have seen presences in the night, voices that emerged from beyond to protect their own. They said that the souls of those who have departed often return to care for those who remain, that the veil between life and death is thinner than we imagine. Over time, I began to accept those words, although the terror of that night never completely dissipated. One of the most disturbing experiences occurred months after the event. I was returning from a family gathering where the festive atmosphere contrasted with my inner restlessness. As I walked along the path, I felt a presence behind me again. This time, the trembling in my back was more pronounced, and as I slowly turned my head, I saw at the end of the path that same man. I couldn't make out his face, but his figure, under the unmistakable hat and boots, emanated an aura of enigmatic solemnity. In that instant, the air turned icy, and a voice that seemed to come from everywhere said to me in a calm tone, "Come back home. I'm waiting for you." It wasn't the exact voice of my grandfather, but it had the same cadence and, above all, the echo of a past that refused to die. The impact was such that, paralyzed with fear, I ran without looking back. Each step was a fight against the panic that gripped me, and when I arrived at home, the feeling of relief was overshadowed by the unease of what I had witnessed. The lights in my living room seemed to turn on and off in strange ways, and for a brief second, I felt as if an icy breath passed through the room. That night, and many subsequent ones, became an eternal reminder that we are not alone, that the inexplicable can arise at the least expected moment. With the passage of time, I learned to live with that duality. On the one hand, the experience left me an indelible scar, a constant fear that made me look askance at every shadow in the night. On the other, I began to see in these manifestations a strange form of protection, an invisible bond that reminded me that, despite death, those we love continue to watch over us. Now, as a grandmother, I watch my grandchildren play in the garden with tenderness and fear. The innocence of their laughter contrasts with the dark possibility that, at some point, they may witness a presence that they do not understand. I have tried to find reasons in logic and science, but fear and uncertainty have taken root inside me. Even on clear days, when the sun illuminates every corner of town, my mind transports me to those moments of darkness and whispers. Sometimes, when passing in front of an old display case or a dark window, I fleetingly perceive the image of that figure, as if time were shattered and the border between yesterday and today dissipated in an instant. One afternoon, while I was looking through old family photographs, I came across an image of my grandfather. His gaze, captured in that instant, seemed to hide a secret, an untold story that would only be revealed to those who dared to face their own fears. That image made me reflect on how little we understand of life and death, and on the possibility that the spirit of those we have lost may return in some form to give us one last message. Over the years, I have heard countless stories from neighbors and friends who claim to have seen wandering shadows in the streets of Blackwood, voices that intertwine with the murmur of the wind on the darkest nights. Although at first I dismissed these stories as simple tales to scare children, today I know that in every whisper of the wind hides a part of that truth. The past is unavoidable. It never completely dies, and the inexplicable dwells in every corner of this world. Every night, when I close my eyes, I wonder if I will ever feel the chill of that presence again, if I will ever hear the echo of those boots marking the path. And although terror remains a silent companion in the darkness, I have also learned to see it as a reminder that sometimes fear is only the shadow of a love that endures beyond life. That feeling, as disturbing as it is comforting, drives me to not forget what I experienced, to keep in my memory the testimony of an encounter that blurred the boundaries of reality. Today, when I relate these events, I do not intend to instill terror in those who read my words, but to share the harsh truth of an experience that taught me to value every moment and to understand that, in the delicate balance between life and death, there are mysteries that transcend our understanding. The return, as I call it, is the tangible manifestation of that invisible bond that unites those who have gone with those who still walk in the darkness of this world. As I write these lines, the rain gently taps the glass, and in the murmur of water, I find the echo of a distant voice. That voice that once filled me with terror. Since I was little, I always believed that my town, Blackwood, was a refuge of peace and simplicity, a place where stories of yesteryear were told by the warmth of the fireplace, and where routine was woven into every corner. Life passed without incident, and on the few occasions when something out of the ordinary happened, it vanished as soon as dawn broke. However, in the silence of our daily lives, an ancestral darkness was hidden, one I never imagined facing. It all began when my sister Clara began to suffer from an inexplicable malaise. At first, her symptoms seemed simple: an unusual tiredness, loss of appetite, and a lethargy that slowly set in. Visits to the doctor were fruitless. The tests revealed no abnormality, and yet, day after day, her health deteriorated alarmingly. My mother, desperate and with no alternatives, remembered the old legends about Madame Lydia, the enigmatic woman who lived alone in a dilapidated hut on the outskirts of town. Although my skepticism told me that all of this was nothing more than superstition, the fear of losing Clara prompted me to accept our mother's suggestion. The road to Madame Lydia's home was long and gloomy. The path led into a dense forest, and the fog that fell as the sun set created elongated shadows, as if the underworld itself took over every branch and leaf. Upon arriving, the house stood imposing and desolate, with peeling walls and opaque windows that seemed to hide unspeakable secrets. The old wooden door opened with a creak that broke the silence of the afternoon, and I was greeted by the serene and enigmatic gaze of Madame Lydia. Without too many words, she led us to an austere room where she placed a bowl with a steaming infusion on a table. My mother, with the unshakable faith of someone who clings to the last hope, urged Clara to take that drink. I watched in disbelief as I felt the atmosphere fill with an almost tangible, mysterious energy that froze my blood. In the days that followed, we noticed a change. Clara regained her appetite and slowly seemed to be back to herself. However, something in her gaze had changed forever. That spark of life had dimmed, leaving behind an unusual emptiness, an inexplicable shadow reflected in her eyes. The transformation was subtle but disturbing, and I soon realized that something sinister was hiding behind the apparent improvement. It wasn't long before the atmosphere in Blackwood began to suffer a silent metamorphosis. Those who, like us, had come to Madame Lydia seemed to carry with them a halo of melancholy and reserve. Genuine laughter turned into measured gestures, and conversations became evasive, as if each word revealed a forbidden secret. While the majority accepted this change with resignation, I couldn't help but feel a growing terror, as if the entire town had sealed a dark pact with forces beyond human understanding. Obsessed with knowing the truth and not letting fear settle permanently inside me, I decided to investigate on my own. One night, armed with a determination overcoming my own skepticism, I headed back toward Madame Lydia's house. The familiar path now seemed like a tunnel into the unknown, and the little light from the moon, hidden behind dense clouds, barely managed to dissipate the shadows that danced around me. When I arrived, the door opened again, as if it knew I was coming to unravel its secrets. With cautious steps, I walked through the dark corridors, where each echo seemed to pronounce warnings. In one of the rooms, I found framed photographs of ancient faces whose eyes seemed to follow me with an accusing gaze, as if they wanted to remind me that in that place, each soul had its outstanding debt. My search led me to a hidden chamber where I discovered a small altar full of objects from ancient times: black candles, bunches of dried herbs, and a notebook with yellowed pages. As I flipped through it, I read notes written in trembling handwriting that recounted forgotten pacts and warned of the inexorable price that Madame Lydia's help demanded. Each word was a cold blow to the heart, for in it was spoken of trapped souls and a dark energy that devoured the essence of those who dared to seek relief in her miracles. As the night progressed, the oppression of the place became unbearable. An inescapable feeling of being watched took hold of me, and in a fit of panic, I tried to flee. However, the main door, as if enchanted, refused to open. The insistent talk of an old clock marked the rhythm of my growing desperation while I realized, with horror, that I had fallen into a trap woven by ancient forces. The infusion of that old woman, far from being a mere remedy, had been the seal of a pact. For each help granted, a part of the vital essence was demanded, an irrecoverable fragment of the soul. I do not remember exactly how long I was trapped in that house, but when I finally managed to force my way out, I knew that my life and my sister's would never be the same. Upon returning to Blackwood, the change was undeniable. Although Clara had recovered her physical health, Something in her being had broken. Her laughter had vanished, and in her gaze, one could perceive a cold distance, as if something precious had been torn from her forever. The days that followed turned into a whirlwind of suspicions and silences. I walked through the streets, and the once vibrant town had plunged into an inexplicable desolation. The neighbors moved like shadows, avoiding any conversation that could reveal the truth. On each face, I noticed the mark of a shared secret, an unspoken act that kept the community prisoner of a past that no one wanted to talk about. Even nature seemed to lament. The trees swayed with a hypnotic movement, and the shadows they projected, elongated figures, seemed to whisper forgotten names. I couldn't help but delve deeper into the history of Blackwood. I investigated dusty archives and listened to scattered stories from old residents, discovering that decades ago, several people had mysteriously disappeared after having gone to Madame Lydia in search of help. Each testimony suggested that what she was offering was not a gift but the collection of a debt that stretched across generations. Restlessness took hold of me, and each new clue only reinforced the idea that the price of her help was an eternal lament, a condemnation that adhered to those who dared to seek solutions in the abyss of the inexplicable. One morning, when I returned home after searching at the local library, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside, a handwritten note in almost faded ink said, "Do not forget that in Blackwood, help has an eternal price." Those words froze my blood. I understood in that instant that my destiny was irrevocably linked to the dark essence of that house, and that the knowledge acquired was as dangerous as it was tempting. Terror began to infiltrate my daily life. As night fell, I woke up assaulted by nightmares in which I found myself trapped in a labyrinth of endless corridors, where the doors opened onto an endless abyss, and Madame Lydia's voice transformed into a hypnotic and threatening murmur. Each awakening was a struggle against the feeling of having left something unfinished, as if a part of me had been trapped in that corner of darkness. Over time, the atmosphere in Blackwood became unbearable. Those who had come to Madame Lydia locked themselves in, and the square, once full of laughter and life, became a stage for silent desolation. Even the murmur of the wind seemed to carry with it a deep lament, the echo of countless souls trapped in an inescapable pact. In my eagerness to discover the truth, I felt that each step brought me closer to an abyss from which there would be no return. Today, as I write these lines, uncertainty and terror still accompany me. I observe Clara, who, despite having recovered her physical health, shows in her eyes an inexplicable emptiness. Innocence has vanished, replaced by a shadow of resignation and fear. Every time I look at her, I feel the weight of what we lost that night in the house, a price I can never recover. I have learned that there are mysteries destined to remain in the shadows, and that the desire to understand them can drag us toward a dark destiny. The pact of Madame Lydia, or what she embodied, left an indelible mark on Blackwood. The voices of the people, although silent, whisper the truth in every corner, and in the solitude of the night, the echo of that inescapable price resonates strongly. Now, every sunset, I find myself remembering that help, no matter how miraculous it may seem, always requires its payment. And so, in the silence of the night, while the gloom envelopes the deserted streets, Madame Lydia's gaze follows me, stalking, reminding me that in this town, the line between hope and damnation is as thin as a sigh. There is no consolation in the certainty that the inexplicable dwells among us. Only remains the bitter resignation of knowing that, in the perpetual silence of the dweller, the lament of our destiny is inescapable and eternal. My life has been marked forever by that night, and even if I try to move on, the shadow of the horror accompanies me with each awakening, reminding me that some traces of the past can never be erased. Perhaps, in some forgotten corner, Madame Lydia's mansion continues to wait for the next desperate soul willing to exchange its essence for a fleeting consolation. And while I remain here, trapped between certainty and terror, I realize that the price of help is not only the transformation of those who dare to seek it, but the irremediable loss of innocence and peace that we once knew. In the end, I am only left with the bitter knowledge that in Blackwood, the lament becomes the background sound of our lives, and that no matter what happens, We will never escape the dark pact that binds us to a truth that is, at the same time, our greatest miracle and our condemnation. I will never forget this night, when darkness took over the ranch and the river transformed into the abyss of my worst nightmares. My name is Margaret, and ever since my husband left for the city to resolve family matters, little Emily and I took refuge in my sister's old ranch, nestled in the mountains. At first glance, the place seemed like a haven of peace, but I soon discovered that beneath the apparent tranquility were hidden secrets I would never have imagined. Life on the ranch passed with an almost disturbing calm. My days slipped by between daily chores and long walks along solitary paths, while the echo of silence grew heavier and heavier. Emily, at only 6 years old, had no company other than mine, and although I tried to alleviate her loneliness by taking her to visit nearby towns or allowing her to run free among the lands, I always felt that something in that place did not fit. Perhaps it was the loneliness of the mountains or the old stories whispered in low voices among the neighbors, but fear subtly settled inside me. I remember that afternoon when the sun, already surrendering, painted the sky in intense oranges and reds. I decided to wash clothes in a rustic stone washhouse erected on the banks of the fast-flowing river that wound through the trees. The structure, inherited from past generations, had an almost mystical air and seemed to hold in its fissures the weight of ancient legends. While I wrung out the clothes in a large bucket, I let the murmur of the water and the distant whisper of the wind envelop me. It was then when suddenly, my attention was diverted to a silhouette on the opposite bank. In the distance, I made out a figure dressed in a white blouse and a simple dress that, at first glance, reminded me of my daughter. However, there was something in the way of walking, slow and stiff steps, as if the figure were moving mechanically, devoid of all spontaneity. With my heart racing, I abandoned my task and entered the river, swimming against the current as I muttered her name in a desperate attempt to get closer. The cold, cutting water seemed to intensify my uncertainty with each stroke. The twilight transformed into a gloom that lengthened the shadows between the trees, giving them almost unreal shapes. The figure followed, but as I approached, I was overcome by confusion. The silhouette, though it evoked the image of my little girl, appeared in a disturbing way. Her skin looked pale and almost translucent, and empty eyes, without reflection or brightness, gave the impression of having lost all humanity. A mixture of terror and maternal urgency drove me to continue. As I approached, the flow of the river began to intensify. What until now had been a calm murmur transformed into a furious torrent, dragging me without compassion. The figure, which seemed to want to guide me, moved slowly upstream, as if it knew I was heading toward a dark destiny. The relentless current raised the water until it touched my waist, and suddenly, I felt an icy contact on my back, like the metallic touch of a strange object. It was then that the image of my daughter became distorted before my eyes. With horror, I saw how that figure, which until moments ago had resembled Emily, began to transform. The innocence of her face faded, replaced by gaunt features and an expression of indescribable terror. Her mouth opened in an inhuman grimace, revealing irregular teeth foreign to any image of childhood. The sight froze my blood, and in the midst of the chaos, a stifled scream mingled with the roar of the river. The struggle to stay afloat became desperate. My arms tangled in an invisible force, and my legs kicked in a futile attempt to reach the shore. The sensation of cold and the growing pressure made me doubt my own existence. As I struggled against the current, the lament I thought I recognized as my daughter's turned into a heartbreaking moan that merged with the rumble of the water. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity, and the image of the creature became clearer. It was not my girl, but a dark entity that had usurped her form, deforming it. I tried to touch what I believed was my daughter, but what I felt was a strangely cold and slippery surface, as if the essence of the creature vanished between my hands. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that this was not innocence incarnate, but an abomination risen from the depths. The current became dense and almost viscous, preventing me from moving forward. In a last effort, I managed to free myself from the lethal embrace that dragged me. With all my strength, I swam frantically toward the shore, ignoring the pain and terror that overwhelmed me. Once on land, my body trembled uncontrollably, and my mind was plunged into a whirlwind of emotions. I ran without stopping, leaving behind the murmur of the river and the abyss I had witnessed. When I arrived at the old ranch, I found Emily in the living room, absorbed in her innocent games, oblivious to the nightmare I had just lived. My husband appeared moments later with a look of astonishment and concern, unable to understand the transformation on my face. I was unable to articulate a word while the image of that grotesque entity repeated itself in my mind, violently engraved in every fiber of my being. A week went by, and despite my efforts to return to normality, the memory of that afternoon refused to dissipate. Each night, the murmur of the water became an echo that transported me back to the moment when the abyss opened its jaws before me. Desperate to find answers, I turned to old legends and tales passed down by word of mouth in nearby towns. I discovered stories of wandering spirits and ancestral curses, tales that spoke of an entity that lived in the rivers of the mountains, destined to claim the innocence of children and condemn them to an existence of deformity and terror. Reading those legends only intensified my anguish, because each word seemed to confirm that what I had experienced was part of a much older and darker evil. With the passage of time, every corner of the ranch was transformed into a scene of painful memories. The cabin, once a cozy refuge, became a threatening place where shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. During the nights, I found myself wandering the halls, unable to fall asleep, fearful that in each whisper and each creak, the presence that had emerged from the river was hidden. The contrast between my daughter's carefree laughter and the constant state of alert in which I lived created in me an unbearable tension, as if the evil that had touched our lives was about to extend its claws to everything I loved. The solitude that had once comforted me had become my worst enemy. Every ray of light seemed insufficient to dispel the shadow that had settled in my soul, and every sound, no matter how insignificant, became a reminder of what had happened. Attempts to find solace, whether through prayers or ancestral purifications, were in vain. Nothing seemed able to erase the indelible mark that experience left inside me. As the months passed, the fear of facing the river forced me to avoid even approaching its banks. Only in the ephemeral safety of the day did I find some peace. But as night fell, the imminent darkness brought with it the certainty that whatever dwelled in the depths was still watching me. Every current, every glimmer of the moon reflected in the water, spoke to me in an ancient and threatening language, reminding me that the border between reality and nightmare had been crossed in that fateful moment. Emily, in her innocence, continued with her life as if nothing had happened. But in her eyes, sometimes I saw flashes of restlessness, as if deep down she perceived the presence of an evil I could not eradicate. That duality, the struggle between childlike innocence and the imminent threat of an all-consuming abyss, became my daily condemnation. Every beat of my heart was a reminder of that afternoon when the river current dragged me into the unknown, of how I almost lost not only my daughter but also my own humanity. Today, as I write these lines with my hands still trembling and my soul marked by terror, I realize that the abyss is not simply a physical space, but a state of mind, an open wound in the spirit that refuses to heal. The constant murmur of the river is now my condemnation, a perpetual echo of that desperate cry that will never go away. The certainty of having witnessed something so aberrant and real haunts me day and night, and every shadow at nightfall reminds me that in the mountains, darkness is always lurking. I have learned to live on the edge of a precipice, aware that any carelessness could drag me back into the void. The ranch, the mountains, the river itself, everything has become a setting where reality merges with nightmare, and where terror hides in every corner. I don't know if one day I will be able to forget what I lived, or if my soul will be condemned to wander between light and darkness, always with the fear that the abyss will return to claim what belongs to it. And so, each dawn finds me with the firm determination to move forward, although each dusk is a fight against oblivion. In those moments, while the darkness looms and the murmur of the water turns into a macabre song, I wonder if the entity I saw that afternoon has remained impregnated in my being, awaiting the moment when the barrier between good and evil collapses completely. I have no answers or certainties, only the bitter conviction that there are forces in this world that escape all explanation, forces as old as the earth itself. The abyss has marked me forever, and although my life seems to return to a certain normality, each shadow and each murmur remind me that in the mountains, the darkness is as real as the light. And so, with a heavy heart and my gaze fixed on the horizon, I move forward, knowing that in some corner of the river, in the incessant echo of the water, the evil awaits, ready to emerge again and claim its revenge. Experience has left me invisible scars, and although I try to convince myself that it's over, the memory insists on reliving every detail. The river, with its unwavering current, is now a mirror of my deepest fears, a perpetual reminder that the inexplicable can invade our lives in an instant, erasing the boundaries between the real and the hellish. As I immerse myself in the daily routine, I always keep in mind that in the solitude of the night, the abyss keeps lurking, waiting for the opportune moment to envelop me in its dark embrace.